So you are a Cincinnati native, headed to Harvard, studied biology, and what happened from there?
Sure, so I thought I was going to be a lab scientist. It turned out I was really poor with my manual skill set and decided I needed to find a different way of engaging with science. And so what I ended up doing was joining the world of biotech investing. So I spent my first 7 years out of college looking at early stage healthcare companies, analyzing the science, understanding where the trends were going, and becoming an investor. And during that time, I actually had a realization about the pharmaceutical industry that you kind of have to see it to believe it in terms of how broken the model for developing drugs really is. And the long story short was one of the biggest opportunities that I saw as an investor is a giant logjam problem where there are way more promising drug candidates deserving to be advanced than actually make it to the finish line, for reasons having often nothing to do with science and more to do with corporate priorities of large pharma, especially during an era of R&D downsizing. And so after having seen that for years as an investor, I thought that somebody should finally do something about it. Decided that that could be me and set up a company to effectively build a faster path for those promising drugs that got stuck. Ultimately to further the mission of making this entire expensive process, it's about $2 billion on average to deliver a new drug to market. For those of you who don't know, that takes over 10 years on average. It's my view that actually a lot of the downstream issues we talk about in the public domain today about pricing and the commercial challenges of the pharmaceutical industry actually trace back upstream to that expensive and time-consuming process. And my goal, and our goal as a company, is to find a better way of doing it more inexpensively and ultimately more efficiently.
And this is what's so interesting to me about your company, and I don't know biopharma terribly well, I wish I knew better, but you have this unique sort of financing model, or at least I should say atypical. So it's, you bought a drug from GlaxoSmithKline a couple of years ago. You paid $5 million up front for it. Then you agreed to pay them $160 million in milestones if it comes to market, and another 12.5% in royalty fees. So
Very, very precise. That's correct, I will say.
Did my homework. So tell me how, how unusual is that? I mean, it seems sort of, from what I understand, sort of novel.
So what I just told you about the pharma industry, the fact that there's this logjam problem of promising drugs deserving to be developed, I'm actually not the first person to make that observation, and neither is our company. There's been a history in the last 10 years of venture-backed biotech companies that take advantage of that logjam by doing deals just like the one that I did with Glaxo. Paying upfront amounts to bring in new molecules, invest further in their development, and then ultimately, in many cases, turn them into successful drugs. But that's generally been done on a single company basis. And there's been a single biotech company that's done that as a one-off act, and then eventually goes on to be bought by another large pharma, just like the origin of the molecule in the first place. And what we're doing that's different, and I see as an opportunity to build a lasting big pharma in its own right, is to make that strategy systematic across disease areas. So what we've done is, as an operating company, set up a family of companies, each of which is focused on a different disease area, each of which can focus on unlocking that logjam in that specific therapeutic category. So we have Axivant, which focuses on neurosciences. There's a newly launched company, Myovant. The senior team is actually based here in San Francisco, focused on women's health and endocrinology and prostate cancer. Another one focused on rare disease, skin diseases, etc. And each of those companies focuses on solving that logjam problem in their own area, ultimately accelerating moving the process of getting the drug to market. And one of the advantages of doing it that way is you can really unlock the entrepreneurial potential of smaller groups of people by tailoring their incentives to the success or failure of their own projects, which is generally something you don't see in large pharma.
Right. I didn't realize this, but in most large pharma, the benefits really accrue to the sort of C-level executives. And what you propose, which is also pretty novel, is you are giving them equity in the companies. But it's so explain to me what happens though when you have somebody who's focused on a drug for urinary tracts or something, or tract infections, and then that drug doesn't make it, and you form this company, and this person has equity that's now worth nothing.
Sure.
What happens to that?
Yeah, so at a very high level, I think one of the issues we're seeking to address by this unique model is that if you're in large pharma, you're a scientist focused on the R&D side of the equation, you don't participate in a lot of the upside in the event that your drug is successful. but you participate in many cases, in all of the downside in the event that it's not, in the form of job security. And as a consequence, human beings respond to incentives. They behave in every bit the manner you'd predict. Constrained risk-taking, often even conducting at worst experiments that are not even designed to get the answer, but often even designed to postpone getting the answer so as to preserve their job security, all of which contributes in a silent way to that $2 billion number that I told you about, which I consider to be, societally offensive. And so what we're seeking to do is to create an environment where those people do participate meaningfully in the upside in the event that their projects succeed, but rather than doing it as a single product biotech company in a VC-backed kind of way, instead we're doing it as a family of companies, each of which has a commitment to the people who work there that in the event your project fails, that doesn't mean that you are an individual failure for having taken that risk, but instead have an opportunity to be reinvested, have your talents reinvested elsewhere in the Roivant platform. So,
but will they understand another type of drug area or therapy? I mean, they seem so sort of specific. So I just wonder if those skills are transferable.
Sure. So the short answer is yes. It's an easy answer, as I believe those skills are transferable within pharma. And in fact, one of the things that we pride ourselves on as a company is drawing diverse talent in each of the companies in our family. So we recruit actually heavily from the pharmaceutical industry, of course, but one of the other things we do is recruit from outside the pharma industry. And while that probably doesn't sound like a novel notion to all of you, in our line of work, that is actually a little bit of a different way of doing business, to draw people in from industries or even educational backgrounds that may, on the face of it, have nothing to do with the pharmaceutical business, but to put them side by side with often the best and the brightest scientists who have developed drugs for decades. And so to me, the notion of even taking someone from a given disease area focus and putting them in a different disease area, of course that's possible. And in fact, we go far in the other direction to even bring in people who may have no antecedent knowledge of our industry at all, but as long as they're bright and passionate and in a position to learn, we can actually unlock a lot of new ideas that have, in meaningful ways, already in our couple of years of existence, contributed to doing this a little bit more efficiently and even conducting clinical trials, say, even more rapidly than the industry average.
And one thing we should mention, which I don't think has been made perfectly clear, is that a lot of people you hire who are coming from traditional pharma, and you're literally like taking groups out of these companies who've worked on these drugs and seen them sort of get abandoned, and then you're sort of putting them to work again to continue their work.
Yeah, so in some cases it actually does work out that way. And one of the general rules that I have for any drug that we're going to acquire from a large pharma company is maybe responsive to a question that I often get, which is, how do you know more about these drugs than somebody who has spent often tens or even hundreds of millions of dollars and years developing that drug to a given stage? And if they decide that, maybe they say it's non-strategic for them and that's why they're not developing it, but how do you know that you could do something more with it? And one of our rules of thumb is that there always has to be a scientific advocate or group of advocates in that prior organization who believed in that drug every bit as much as we do. And our goal is, as a business, just to provide them a platform and a set of resources that can ultimately carry that drug to the finish line. And as you said, in some cases, we even take the people who had previously been with the project. For example, in the GlaxoSmithKline case, the person actually who ran their neurosciences unit joined our organization before we actually acquired the drug and has now in many ways helped shepherd it forward. So that's a pattern that I expect to continue going forward. But I think the unique combination of the people who are in a new environment able to unleash their entrepreneurial potential, promising drug candidates, and then the third ingredient, which you mentioned in the introduction, is it is a capital-intensive business. Those are really the three legs to the stool in making this a successful model. And in our first couple of years, at least, we've had, I believe, some success in putting all three in place.
Absolutely. But so I think where the controversy comes, because your profile has become so high in this world, you created Axovant around this around this Alzheimer's drug that you obtained from GlaxoSmithKline. You had this very, splashy IPO, and there's no proof yet that the drug works. And so it's in the phase 3 trial right now. It's going to conclude this year. So it's sort of like the sands are going through the hourglass in a way. Do you feel that way? I mean, like, if it works, great. If it doesn't,
Yeah, sure. I mean, look, I think that Alzheimer's, just to put this in context, so it was particularly fitting for our model that the first major drug that we acquired, pursuant to this broader model that we're building, happens to be in one of the riskiest areas in all of drug development. I mean, this is Alzheimer's disease, just talk about it for a moment. I mean, this is probably the single greatest health threat to, I would say, the economic security of our country over the next 40 years. If we don't do anything about it, it's probably the one disease area that we can definitively say has the potential to literally bankrupt our system unless it's stemmed head on. And for that reason, it's been a source of great attention from the pharmaceutical industry, but one of the few areas where there has not been a single major advance in the last 10 to 15 years, right? So against that backdrop, there is, as you put it, and I have experienced a tremendous amount of skepticism about our taking on a project that appears to have been even abandoned by another pharmaceutical company in taking on that major challenge. And given the history of failure, I actually can't blame somebody who's skeptical from the outside. I would be too, and the industry, and the patient community here has been burned several times too many by Alzheimer's therapies in development getting hyped too much. Now, we could have a much longer discussion about why I'm personally optimistic about our prospects for success, but I can't promise the success of that individual clinical trial or else we wouldn't have to do it. But for our model more generally, I think it'd be a great success that probably automatically catapults us into major pharmaceutical company status. But if it's not that, I do believe that the model is still one that stands on its own feet irrespective of the success or failure of any given one of the clinical trials. And in fact, I think it's embracing that attitude that ultimately helps us be great in acknowledging that science is about not only successes, but taking bold bets that do fail along the way, but having a business model that can be resilient to those failures.
Sure, and when we had talked earlier in time, we sort of talked about, like any other portfolio, some things are not going to work, some things will work. But, your own board member had said in an interview with Stat magazine, just that in biotech, your first impression is your first drug. So I'm just wondering, do you feel like you have to have, and I know you've got a number of other things cooking, which we can talk about, but do you feel like, how big is that a concern?
Sure. No, I don't consider it a major concern. Look, every one of the drugs that we're taking forward because we think the rationale was sound, notwithstanding the lack of corporate focus on it from an organization that generally had to cut R&D and focus on other disease areas. So take areas like immuno-oncology. So this is a very hot area in the biopharma space right now. Areas like harnessing the immune system to fight off a body's own cancer. We're really enthusiastic about the prospects for success of a lot of the drugs in development there, but that has become a fad in large pharma. And amidst a lot of revenue streams that are coming off patent and a constraining R&D budget, the small resources of which are going to the areas that today happen to be really hot, leave a major vacuum in other major areas like neurosciences research, like women's health. Innovation in women's health is an area that has been sorely lacking in the last 20 years, like rare diseases where we're focused as a company through our business Enzyman. I mean, these are areas where we are taking bold bets that others weren't willing to take. And to answer your question, the latest stage drugs in our collective pipeline are certainly our Alzheimer's programs and our dementia programs. And then we have several phase 3 studies ongoing in some women's health indications, including endometriosis and uterine fibroids. We have a phase 3 prostate cancer study that's going to be launching over the course of the year. And then we actually have a therapy that I haven't talked a lot about before, but it is a novel biologic therapy. So that's not a pill, but a complex injection that is a therapy that's being developed for children who generally die by the age of 2 from a rare disease called complete de Jour syndrome. And what we hope we're developing and could be filing for approval as early as next year is a therapy that could be a one-time transformation of that condition and hopefully even a life-saving one for these children. So those are examples of some of the late-stage products in our portfolio, and I can't promise that any given one of them is definitively going to make it to the finish line, but fast forward 2 to 3 years from now, and I think it'd be totally fair to judge us based on whether at least 1 or 2 or hopefully all 3 or 4 of those ever really made it to the finish line.
Yeah, I did not realize you had so many 2 or 3 that were in phase 3 trials. Now this de Jour syndrome drug you mentioned could get designated as a breakthrough therapy, in which case the FDA sort of approves it much more quickly than it does normally. What's interesting to me is, so horrible as it sounds, is it a big enough market? I mean, when you are dealing with these very small sort of orphan diseases, how do you what's the calculation in your mind?
Yeah, so usually the way the biotech industry is organized is you have a handful of companies focusing on these ultra-rare diseases, you have the big pharma companies focusing on large-scale unmet medical needs. Our view is if the science supports it, if there's a major unmet medical need where we can make a difference and there's a promising molecule, we're in that game, especially if our unique participation in that would help bring that molecule to market. So in all of the cases where we're involved, I believe that the drugs that we are developing would not have seen the light of day had we not gotten behind them. And the fact that certain of those conditions affect only tens of people instead of hundreds of thousands or millions, to us is not a deterrent, but really puts pressure on us to think about more innovative ways of how we commercialize those therapies in a way that improves access, but also allows us to make a sustainable business out of it. I will say that coming back to the original theme that I mentioned, because we are often taking these projects on later in their development cycles, and because our business's core competency, I believe, is to make that process more cost efficient of developing those medicines to market, we may not be under the same pressure as a conventional pharmaceutical company that needs to charge a given price in order to earn a positive return on that investment. And we think that could actually be a sustainable competitive advantage for our business going into the future where, just think about it, if it costs $2 billion to develop a drug, whether you charge $30,000 or $35,000 might make all the difference for whether you have a positive return on the project. And many reports would say that the return on investment in pharma R&D is in the low single-digit percentages today. On the other hand, if you're spending an order of magnitude lower than that, $100 or $200 million, the math is very different, and it's more or less irrelevant from a return on investment standpoint whether you pick that at $30,000 or $40,000 or $50,000 or something else. And I think that the future of pharma, and especially some of the commercial challenges that you can now read about in the papers in vogue today, less so at the time we started our business, but our mission is the same, is to find ways of developing a competitive advantage from more efficiently conducting the clinical trials themselves and achieving the FDA approval in a way that will make the commercial model follow from that. So as it relates to Enzivant and the therapy we're developing there, obviously I'm not in a position to talk about our commercial strategy now, and it's all subject to going through the FDA review process. But even when that day comes, I believe that we will be in a position to be, I'll say at a high level, much more creative in how we approach that commercialization rather than having to stick to the old pharma dogma of charging one clear upfront price on the day a drug is delivered. And maybe even for therapies that can make a big difference, find ways of even sharing in the risk with the system to ultimately, if a therapy is going to make a patient live a lot longer than they otherwise would have, if we really believe in it, maybe we can find ways to even share in that risk in terms of how we get compensated.
I think we're going to have to wrap up in a few minutes here, but one thing that was interesting when you talked about the drug own, and you were talking earlier about hiring people who are sort of non-traditional hires into your business. So explain this, you're maintaining that you can sort of do analysis on these drugs that's not been done before, which I'm not disputing, but I am kind of curious as to how a company with 150 people does this versus Merck or Pfizer, which has 50,000 or 100,000.
Yes, so let me distinguish what our discovery process looks like for new drugs relative to the conventional discovery process. I actually think the conventional pharma industry does an outstanding job of discovering new molecules in the laboratory. So these are new chemicals, lab bench scientists wearing white coats, the kinds of things you imagine when you think of drug discovery. I think they do a tremendously good job of that. The irony is that having done such a great job of discovering often thousands of promising chemical entities, they do a much poorer job in finding the path forward through human clinical trials to get those drugs to the finish line. And the riskiest and most expensive part of the process often is that upstream discovery effort where they're employing tens of thousands of employees. By contrast, what our discovery effort looks like is a little bit different. We don't have people walking on white coats with lab benches, but we do hire MIT-trained computer scientists and even folks from other industries, the semiconductor business to some folks who may come from within pharma, to map out what we call the drug own, the universe of available drugs that could be utilized, which aren't being utilized today, for a particular disease against a particular biological target in a way that our group ultimately can take advantage of when we then potentially acquire that drug from the shelf of a pharmaceutical company, or even partner with them on the active development of a drug, but to target a new disease area in so doing. So That's what we're about, and that has a nice business benefit because we can do that with a much leaner team and even in a more capital efficient way than the historical drug discovery model, which, thank God that it exists, because I think there's a treasure trove of potential new breakthroughs that could come of that. But, I think it's a sad state of affairs that we, as a society, as an industry, don't really squeeze as much benefit out of all that great discovery work that's ongoing. And at Roivant, our model is to do our small part to actually harvest some of the benefit of that investment that's already been made.
Last question, you've got like 4 or 5 holding companies as it is, or is that?
So Roivant is the umbrella
Holding
organization,
company,
and then there's 5 companies today
5 companies, right?
in the Roivant
And
family.
you're working on 12 things. Is pacing like a huge issue for you? You just mentioned this treasure trove. You've raised $1 billion. You've told me that you're fine financially. Is there anything coming up? Or are you?
Yeah, sure. Look, I mean, it's like our business is scaling like any other. There are challenges that come up along the way. We, like most growing companies, I'm sure some folks in the room could also empathize, face our own form of growing pains. We're very ambitious. We do have, I think today, 13 or 14 drugs in our pipeline. We intend to expand that over the course of the coming year. We're told that's too much. It's going to stretch our team. It's going to result in mistakes that could have been avoided. I'm sure that will happen, and I can't tell you what those will be, but of course we do face growing pains as an organization, but ultimately are hiring we consider to be the best and brightest from within and beyond the industry. And as long as we approach that like any business with a willingness to learn from our mistakes and get better, then I think we're not going to solve that problem by being less ambitious in terms of the number of projects we take on.
Well, I wish you all the luck in the world. I hope everything works out, because we could certainly use a cure to Alzheimer's right away.
Thank you, Connie. Yeah, appreciate you. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you, friends. So we're going to take a 10-minute break. Get a drink, get a bite, and do not forget to come back, because in 10 minutes.